The distress signal came through on a cold morning in March when most of Earth was still asleep, and Daniel Harper was drinking his third cup of coffee on the bridge of the USS Defender. He was a captain who had spent 15 years in space and had seen many strange things, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to read on his screen. The message had traveled across 3 star systems, and every word of it made his hands shake as he held the datapad. His crew was quiet around him because they could see something was very wrong with their captain, who never showed fear or anger on his face. Lieutenant Amy Stevens was the first to speak, and her voice was so quiet that Daniel almost missed it when she said that they were receiving confirmation from the Colonial Administration about New Horizon Colony. She did not want to say the next part, but she had to because it was her duty, and she told him there were no survivors left on the planet. Daniel felt his chest tighten because he knew what that meant, and he knew that 40,000 people had lived on New Horizon with their families and children and dreams of a better life among the stars. Those people had spent years building farms and schools and homes on a planet that was supposed to be safe and peaceful and far away from the troubles of Earth. Commander Peter Blake walked onto the bridge carrying a datapad, and his face was pale like he had seen a ghost or something worse than a ghost. He had been reviewing the preliminary report from the reconnaissance drone that had reached the colony site just a few hours earlier, and what he had seen on that drone footage had changed something inside him. Peter was a man who smiled often and made jokes to keep the crew happy, but today, there was no smile and no jokes and only a cold fury in his eyes that Daniel had never seen before. Peter handed the datapad to Daniel without saying a word because words felt useless in the face of what they were about to see. The holographic display came to life above the bridge console and showed aerial footage of what used to be New Horizon Colony. Where streets and buildings had stood just days ago, there was now only black ash and scorched earth that stretched for miles in every direction. The destruction was complete and systematic, and there was no doubt that this had been done on purpose by someone who wanted to erase every trace of human life from that planet. Daniel looked at the burn patterns and recognized them immediately because he had studied alien weapons for years, and he knew these marks belonged to the Vakari Dominion. The Vakari were a species that humans had tried to befriend with trade agreements and diplomatic missions and cultural exchanges, but apparently friendship meant nothing to them. Amy was working at her station with trembling fingers as she pulled up the timeline of events that led to the destruction. According to the colony logs, the Vakari fleet had arrived in orbit without any warning or communication, and they had ignored every attempt by the colonists to make contact. The colonists had sent greetings in 17 different languages and had offered to negotiate about any misunderstandings or territorial disputes, but the Vakari had not responded with words. Instead, they had responded with plasma cannons and orbital bombardment that lasted for 6 hours until nothing living remained on the surface. The colony defense systems had been minimal because humans did not believe in heavily arming civilian settlements, and that peaceful philosophy had cost 40,000 lives. The bridge fell into a heavy silence as the crew watched the footage and tried to process what they were seeing. Some of the younger crew members had tears in their eyes, and some of the older ones had faces like stone. But everyone felt the same thing, which was a mixture of grief and rage and helplessness. For 200 years, humanity had explored space with open hands and open hearts, and they had always chosen peace over conflict, even when it was difficult. They had signed treaties with dozens of alien civilizations and had worked hard to prove that humans were good neighbors who could be trusted. That philosophy had guided every decision that Earth made in the HFY galaxy, and it had kept humanity safe and respected for generations. But now that philosophy felt like a terrible mistake, because it had made humans look weak to species, like the Vakari who only understood strength and violence. Daniel thought about all the families on New Horizon who had trusted Earth to keep them safe, and how that trust had been betrayed by a government that chose diplomacy over defense. He thought about the children who had been playing in parks just days ago, and who would never grow up to see another sunrise. He thought about the parents who had died trying to protect those children, and how their last moments must have been filled with terror and confusion about why this was happening to them. Admiral Gregory Stone appeared on the view screen, and his face showed every one of his 60 years in military service. He had been a soldier before he became an admiral, and he understood what war meant and what it cost. Gregory looked at Daniel with tired eyes and told him that he was being ordered to return to Earth immediately, because the Security Council was convening an emergency session to decide how humanity would respond. Daniel wanted to argue and say that they should pursue the Vakari fleet right now, while the trail was still fresh, but he knew that Gregory was right. This decision was too big for one captain or one ship, and it needed to involve all of humanity. Daniel suggested that they could catch up to the Vakari fleet if they left immediately, but Gregory shook his head and said this was bigger than revenge or one ship. He said that humanity needed to decide together how to respond to this act of war, and whether they would continue being peaceful or become something else. The weight of that decision hung in the air between them, and both men knew that whatever humanity chose in the next few days would change everything about their place in the galaxy. Gregory ordered Daniel to come home, and then the view screen went dark, leaving the bridge in silence. The USS Defender turned slowly in space and began the journey back to Earth, while behind them the ruins of New Horizon grew, smaller and smaller until they vanished into the darkness. Daniel stood at his station watching the stars drift by and wondering if humanity had been naive to think that peace alone could protect them in a galaxy full of predators. He had joined the space service because he believed in exploration and discovery, and making friends with alien civilizations, but now he wondered if all of that had been a beautiful dream that was about to turn into a nightmare. The crew around him was quiet and thoughtful, and everyone knew that they were heading back to a Earth that would be different from the one they had left. Somewhere in the distance, the Vakari fleet was returning to their home space, probably celebrating their easy victory over the weak humans who did not fight back. They had no idea what was coming for them, and they had no idea that they had just woken something in humanity that had been sleeping for 200 years. Daniel touched the pocket of his uniform where he kept a photo of New Horizon from happier times, and he made a silent promise to all those dead colonists that their deaths would not be forgotten or forgiven. The gentle era of human space exploration was ending, and something darker was about to begin. The United Earth Assembly Hall was filled with voices and anger and fear, as representatives from every nation and colony gathered to decide the fate of humanity's future in the galaxy. President Helen Morrison stood at the central podium waiting for silence, and her face showed the burden she was carrying because this decision would define her presidency and possibly define the human species for centuries to come. The massive screens behind her showed images from New Horizon that made even the most hardened politicians look away, because seeing the destruction of an entire colony was different from reading about it in reports. Children's toys lay scattered among the ruins, and that simple detail made the tragedy more real than any statistics or casualty numbers. Helen began to speak, and her voice carried across the vast chamber, reaching every corner where representatives sat with grim faces. She said they faced a moment that would define their species, and that the Vakari Dominion had committed an act of genocide against innocent people who had done nothing wrong except exist in a place the Vakari wanted. She said that humanity's commitment to peace had been viewed as weakness by the Vakari and by other species who were watching to see how Earth would respond. The room was silent as Helen spoke because everyone knew she was right, and everyone knew that whatever they decided today would echo through history. Ambassador Marcus Webb stood to speak, and he was a man who had spent 20 years talking with alien civilizations and always preaching restraint and always choosing diplomacy over conflict. His normally calm face was twisted with anger and pain as he told the assembly about his meeting with the Galactic Council 3 days earlier. He had stood before representatives of 100 alien species and demanded answers about the massacre on New Horizon, and demanded justice for the 40,000 dead. The Galactic Council had listened politely, and then they had said words that Marcus would never forget and would never forgive. They had called it an internal matter, and said that humanity had encroached on Vakari, territorial claims without proper permission. They had said the colonists should have been more careful about where they settled, and should have done more research about local political situations. Marcus's voice rose with anger as he told the assembly that the Galactic Council had justified the murder of 40,000 people, including 8,000 children, as a property dispute. That was humanity's own fault. The assembly erupted in outrage and shouting, and it took several minutes for Helen to restore order, because everyone wanted to speak at once and everyone was furious. General Linda Hayes approached the podium in her crisp military uniform, and her bearing was perfect like every career soldier, but her eyes burned with a cold fury that made even the Politicians nervous. She had been preparing for this moment her entire career because she had always known that eventually, humanity would have to fight, and she had built a military force that was ready. Linda said that humanity had spent 2 centuries building a fleet designed for exploration and peaceful defense. But that era was over. She requested full authorization to mobilize every military asset Earth possessed, and to prepare for total war against the Vakari Dominion. Counselor Robert Grant from the European sector stood up and said that humanity had always maintained they would not be the aggressor in galactic affairs and asked if responding with overwhelming force would make them the very thing they had tried not to be. It was a fair question, and many in the assembly nodded because they worried about losing the moral high ground that humanity had worked so hard to establish. Robert said that violence would only lead to more violence and that perhaps there was still a diplomatic solution if they tried harder to negotiate. His words were met with angry shouts from other representatives who thought diplomacy had failed and that more talking would only get more humans killed. Linda looked at Robert with cold eyes and said 5 words that silenced the entire chamber, which were that the Vakari had slaughtered human children. She let those words hang in the air for a moment and then continued by saying that if humanity did not respond, then they were telling every hostile species in the galaxy that human lives were cheap and could be taken without consequence. She said that other species were watching Earth right now and deciding whether humans were prey or predators, and that this decision would determine how humanity was treated for generations. The assembly fell quiet because everyone understood the truth in what Linda was saying, even if they did not want to admit it. Helen raised her hand for silence and said she had reviewed all the intelligence reports and had consulted with experts who studied Vakari psychology and culture. She said the Vakari did not attack New Horizon because of territorial disputes or political misunderstandings, but because they wanted to test humanity's resolve. They wanted to see if humans would fight back or if they would accept their place as victims who could be pushed around by stronger species. The Vakari had studied human history and had seen 200 years of peaceful expansion and diplomatic solutions, and they had concluded that humans were soft and weak and would not defend themselves. Helen paused and looked around the chamber at all the faces watching her and waiting for her guidance. She said the Vakari had made a grave miscalculation because they forgot to ask themselves one crucial question, which was what happens when you back a peaceful species into a corner. They forgot to ask what happens when you force humanity to remember that they did not reach the top of Earth's food chain by being gentle and kind. Humans had been apex predators on their homeworld for thousands of years and had conquered every environment and every challenge through intelligence and ruthlessness and adaptation. That nature had been hidden under 2 centuries of civilization and peaceful philosophy, but it was still there, waiting to be released. Captain Daniel Harper stood among the military observers watching the debate and thinking about his crew, who had signed up to explore the universe and make new discoveries. They were good people who believed in science and diplomacy and cultural exchange, but now they were being asked to become warriors. He thought about the families on New Horizon who would never come home and about the parents waiting on Earth who would never see their children again. He thought about what kind of galaxy his grandchildren would inherit and whether it would be one where humans were respected or one where they were victims. The vote was called and the chamber fell into absolute silence as representatives entered their decisions into the voting system. The results appeared on the screens within seconds and showed that every single representative had voted yes for military authorization. It was unanimous and unprecedented, and it showed that humanity was united in a way they had not been for generations. Helen looked at the results and felt both pride and sadness because she knew what this meant for the future. Helen turned to General Linda and said 6 words that would change everything, which were to show the galaxy what happens when humanity stops being civilized. Linda nodded and saluted and left the chamber to begin mobilizing the largest military force humanity had ever assembled. Outside the assembly hall, the news spread quickly, and within hours the entire solar system knew that Earth was going to war. Recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers, and factories began working around the clock to produce weapons and ships and ammunition. The peace that had lasted 200 years was ending, and humanity was remembering how to be dangerous. In orbit around Earth, the shipyards came alive with activity as exploration. Vessels were retrofitted with weapons and defensive systems. Scientists who had spent careers studying alien biology were now studying alien weaknesses and how to exploit them. Diplomats who had built relationships with friendly species were now asking those species to stay neutral in the coming conflict. Everything that humanity had built in 2 centuries of peaceful expansion was being repurposed for war, and it was happening with terrifying speed and efficiency. Helen stood alone in her office after the assembly had ended and looked out at Earth spinning slowly below her station. She wondered if she had made the right choice and if there had been another way to handle this situation. But then she thought about the 8,000 children who had died on New Horizon, and she knew there was no other choice. The Vakari had forced this decision, and now they would live with the consequences. She activated her personal comm and sent a message to the Vakari, government giving them 72 hours to surrender those responsible for the massacre or face total war. The Vakari response came within an hour, and it was not an apology or an offer to negotiate. Instead, they sent a declaration that humanity was an inferior species that had no right to colonize space, and that more human settlements would be destroyed if Earth did not withdraw from disputed territories. It was the worst possible response, and it sealed the Vakari's fate. Helen forwarded the message to Linda with a simple note that said to proceed with all planned operations. The time for talking was over, and the time for action had begun. The shipyards orbiting Earth worked without stopping as thousands of engineers and technicians transformed peaceful exploration vessels into weapons of war. Daniel Harper walked through the USS Defender and barely recognized his own ship because everything had changed in just 2 weeks. The corridors that used to be painted in soft colors were now military gray, and the observation lounges where crew members used to relax had been converted into tactical planning rooms. His ship had been built to discover new worlds and make friends with alien species, but now it was being rebuilt to destroy those who threatened humanity. Chief Engineer Paul Martinez met Daniel in the main cargo bay, which had been completely gutted and refitted with new systems. Paul was a cheerful man who usually made jokes while he worked, but today his face was serious as he explained the upgrades. He showed Daniel the new railguns that could fire tungsten rounds at speeds that would punch through most alien ship armor, like it was paper. The shields had been upgraded to withstand direct hits from Vakari plasma cannons, and the engines had been modified to give them better acceleration in combat situations. Paul pointed to the torpedo bays and said they had installed something special that would make the Vakari understand. They had made a terrible mistake. Daniel asked what kind of special, and Paul's expression darkened as he explained about the new weapons humanity had developed specifically for this war. These were not the defensive weapons that human ships had carried before, but offensive systems designed to cripple and destroy enemy vessels with maximum efficiency. Paul said that humanity had always had the ability to build terrible weapons, but had chosen not to because they believed in a better path. Now that path had led to 40,000 dead, and it was time to show the galaxy what humans were really capable of when they stopped holding back. Throughout the solar system, similar transformations were happening to every human vessel. Colony ships that had been designed to carry families and supplies were being converted into troop carriers with armor plating and point defense systems. Science vessels that had explored distant stars were becoming electronic warfare ships that could jam enemy communications and targeting systems. Even civilian freighters were being armed with missile pods and reinforced hulls so they could support the main fleet in combat. Humanity was mobilizing every resource it had because this was not going to be a limited war with rules and restraint, but total war where only victory mattered. In a secure facility deep beneath the Nevada desert, a team of scientists worked on weapons that made even hardened soldiers feel uncomfortable. Dr. Susan Clark stood before a holographic display, showing simulations of the new systems and explaining to General Linda Hayes how each one worked. Susan was a physicist who had spent her career studying peaceful applications of fusion technology, but now she was designing bombs that could crack planets. She said that humans had always had the theoretical knowledge to build weapons of mass destruction, but had chosen not to because they wanted to be better than their violent past. Linda watched the simulations and asked what had changed, and Susan said that 40,000 dead colonists had changed everything. She pulled up a schematic showing something called the Ragnarok missile, which was designed to penetrate deep into a planet's crust and trigger seismic events that would devastate continents. Susan said they had 40 of these missiles in production, and each one represented enough destructive power to end a civilization. Linda studied the weapon in silence and then said very clearly, that these would not be used on civilian targets because humanity was going to war to punish genocide, not commit it themselves. Susan agreed and said the Vakari just needed to know the weapons existed because fear could be as powerful as actual destruction. If the enemy knew that humanity had the capability to destroy their homeworld, then maybe they would think twice before attacking human colonies again. It was a dark kind of diplomacy, but it was the only language that species like the Vakari seemed to understand. Linda approved the production run and then moved on to inspect the next facility, where other terrible innovations were being prepared for deployment. Across Earth, the mood was somber but determined as billions of people prepared for war. News broadcasts showed families holding vigils for the lost colonists of New Horizon, and the images of those memorials were broadcast across every human settlement in the galaxy. Recruitment centers had lines stretching for blocks as young men and women volunteered to serve in the military and defend humanity from future attacks. The pacifist movement that had dominated human politics for decades had essentially vanished overnight because it was hard to argue for peace when faced with images of murdered children. Daniel gathered his crew in the main hangar of the USS Defender because he needed to talk to them before they departed for Vakari space. 300 men and women stood before him, and their faces showed the weight of what was coming. Lieutenant Amy Stevens was there, and Commander Peter Blake and dozens of others who had served with him for years exploring peaceful space. These were people who had joined the service to see wonders and meet new civilizations, but now they were being asked to kill and possibly die in a war they had never wanted. Daniel began by saying he would not lie to them about what they were going to do. He said they were going to bring war to the Vakari Dominion and make them regret every life they had taken on New Horizon. He said this went against everything they had believed in and everything they had trained for, but it was necessary because the alternative was to let humanity be seen as prey that could be hunted without consequence. The crew listened in silence, and Daniel could see fear and determination mixed together on their faces. He paused and looked at each person and tried to memorize their faces because he knew some of them might not survive what was coming. Then he said something that was important for all of them to remember, which was that they were not going to become monsters. They would fight military targets and spare civilians and show the galaxy that humanity could be ruthless without losing their souls. He asked if he could count on all of them to remember that, and the response was immediate and unanimous. They were ready to do what needed to be done. Admiral Gregory Stone addressed the assembled fleet through a holographic broadcast that reached every ship gathered near Mars. 500 warships floated in perfect formation and represented the combined might of humanity's military forces. There were battleships and cruisers and destroyers and carriers and support vessels, all painted in the dark colors of war. It was the largest military force humanity had ever assembled, and it was aimed at one target, which was the Vakari Dominion that had underestimated the human capacity for violence. Gregory told the fleet that in 200 years of space exploration, humanity had never fired the first shot and had never sought conquest or desired war. He said that humans had always extended friendship first and had worked hard to prove they were peaceful and trustworthy neighbors. But the Vakari Dominion had forced Earth's hand by committing an act of genocide that could not be ignored or forgiven. He said their mission was clear, which was to dismantle the Vakari military capability and bring justice for New Horizon. Gregory emphasized that this was not a war of extermination or revenge, but a war of accountability. They would destroy military targets and cripple the Vakari ability to threaten others, but they would not slaughter civilians or commit the same crimes that had been committed against humanity. He said they needed to show the galaxy what humans were capable of when provoked, but also show that humans could wage war without losing their moral compass. It was a difficult balance, but it was necessary. If humanity wanted to maintain any respect in the galactic community, the countdown to departure began and ships started running final system checks and loading supplies for the long journey to Vakari space. Daniel stood in his quarters looking at a photograph of New Horizon, taken during happier times when the colony was thriving and full of life. He saw children playing in parks and families sharing meals and people building homes and dreaming of the future. All of it had been erased in a single afternoon of senseless violence, and he carefully folded the photograph and placed it in his uniform pocket as a reminder of why they were doing this. He returned to the bridge and took his seat in the captain's chair that had been his home for so many years. The crew was at their stations and ready, and the ship hummed with power as the engines came online. Amy reported that all systems were green, and Peter confirmed that the fleet was ready to depart. Daniel gave the order to move out, and the USS Defender began accelerating toward the edge of the solar system, where they would enter hyperspace and begin the journey to war. As Earth shrank behind them, Daniel thought about what they were about to unleash. The Vakari had awakened something in humanity that had been sleeping for 2 centuries, and now that beast was loose and hungry for justice. He wondered if the galaxy was ready for what was coming, and he suspected that most species had no idea what humans were capable of when they stopped asking for permission to exist and started demanding respect through force. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Vakari territory, like a storm of metal and fury that had been building for weeks. Daniel Harper watched his tactical display as 500 warships spread into attack formation, with the precision of a machine that had been designed for exactly this purpose. Every captain knew their role, and every ship moved into position without hesitation, because they had drilled these maneuvers 1,000 times in simulations. Now those simulations were becoming reality, and the Vakari were about to discover that humanity had been preparing for war even while preaching peace. Lieutenant Amy Stevens reported from her station that all ships were ready and that they were receiving targeting data from Admiral Gregory Stone's flagship. The Vakari border defense station hung in space ahead of them, and it was a massive structure that bristled with weapons and shields. This station had stood for 300 years as a symbol of Vakari military power and had never been successfully attacked by any enemy. In the next few minutes, it would become a symbol of something else, which was the price of underestimating humanity and thinking that peaceful species were easy prey. Admiral Gregory's voice came through the fleet channel and told everyone that the Vakari had been given 72 hours to surrender those responsible for the New Horizon massacre and pay reparations to the families of the dead. The Vakari response had been to fortify their borders and declare that humans were an inferior species meant for extermination. They had chosen war over justice, and now they would face the consequences of that choice. Gregory gave the order that all ships were weapons-free and told them to show the Vakari the error of their judgment. The USS Defender's railguns opened fire in perfect synchronization with the rest of the fleet, and the sound of the discharge vibrated through the hull like a drumbeat of retribution. Magnetic accelerators launched tungsten projectiles at speeds that approached a fraction of light speed, and each round carried enough kinetic energy to punch through armor like it was tissue paper. The Vakari defense station's shields flared bright as they absorbed the initial hits, but humanity had studied alien shield technology for decades and knew exactly how to overwhelm them. The station fired back with plasma cannons that sent streams of superheated matter toward the human fleet. The USS Defender's shields absorbed the hits, and the ship shuddered with each impact. But the shields held because human engineering had improved dramatically in the 2 weeks since mobilization began. Daniel ordered concentrated fire on the station's shield generators and watched as his crew worked with calm efficiency to destroy the enemy defenses. Within 30 seconds, the station's shields collapsed under the sustained barrage, and the hull was exposed to direct fire. Commander Peter Blake reported multiple hull breaches on the enemy station and said they were detecting atmosphere venting from several sections. Daniel ordered his crew to target only the weapon systems and give the Vakari crew a chance to evacuate, because humanity did not want to be remembered as butchers who killed unnecessarily. But the Vakari chose to keep fighting, and their plasma cannons continued firing even as their station came apart around them. It was brave in a way, but also foolish because the outcome was already decided. The battle lasted 20 minutes from start to finish, and when it ended, the Vakari defense station was a crippled wreck drifting in space. Escape pods were launching from multiple sections as the surviving crew abandoned their post, and Daniel ordered his ships to let them go, because there was no honor in shooting at defenseless lifeboats. A Vakari officer appeared on screen, and his reptilian features were twisted in what might have been fear or rage or both. He said that humanity was violating every law of civilized warfare, and that the Galactic Council would hear about this attack. Daniel looked at the Vakari officer with cold eyes and said that the Galactic Council had their chance to deliver justice and chose to protect murderers instead. He said the Vakari were now facing human justice and it would be swift and merciless. The officer said they had only destroyed one colony and demanded to know why humanity was waging war against their entire civilization. Daniel felt anger rise in his chest, and he said that the Vakari had murdered 40,000 people and expected no consequences, but they were about to learn that humanity had long memories and protected their own. He told the Vakari officer that they had wanted to see if humans would fight back, and now they had their answer. Then he cut the transmission and ordered his helmsman to set course for the Vakari shipyards at Corvin Prime, because it was time to dismantle the enemy's ability to threaten anyone else. The fleet moved deeper into Vakari space, leaving the destroyed defense station behind as a marker of humanity's resolve. They encountered resistance at every jump point, with Vakari patrol ships and destroyers throwing themselves at the advancing armada, but it made no difference. Human ships moved with precision that came from centuries of simulated warfare that everyone had hoped would never be needed. The tactics had been developed by strategists who studied every major conflict in human history and adapted those lessons for space combat. Captains made decisions in microseconds, and crews executed orders with mechanical efficiency. The Vakari fought with courage, but courage could not overcome superior technology and training and the cold mathematics of tactical superiority. At Corvin Prime, the Vakari made their last stand with 200 warships, forming a defensive wall around their most important military installation. The shipyards were massive structures where new vessels were built, and old ones were repaired, and losing them would cripple the Vakari military for years. Admiral Gregory sent one final message, giving them a chance to surrender the war criminals and agree to disarmament, but the Vakari response was a volley of missiles that streaked toward the human fleet. Gregory said 2 words, which were "so be it," and then gave the order for all ships to engage at will. The battle that followed would be studied in military academies for generations as an example of how superior tactics could overcome numerical equality. Human ships moved through the enemy formation like sharks through a school of fish, and their AI-assisted targeting systems eliminated threats with surgical precision. The Vakari fought desperately, but desperation was not enough against an enemy that had prepared for this moment. Daniel's USS Defender destroyed 3 enemy cruisers in the opening minutes as railgun rounds punched through their hulls and turned the interiors into clouds of debris. Around him, the void blazed with weapons fire and exploding ships, and for a moment he felt sick, watching so many lives end in fire and vacuum. But then he thought about New Horizon and the children who had died there, and the sickness was replaced by grim determination. The Vakari had started this war, and humanity would finish it. Peter reported that multiple enemy vessels were breaking formation and trying to retreat. Daniel ordered his crew to let them go because their target was the shipyard, not a slaughter of fleeing ships. The Vakari fleet scattered, and the human armada turned its attention to the massive orbital construction facility, where dozens of warships in various stages of completion hung in the docking bays. These ships represented years of military investment and thousands of workers who had built them piece by piece. Admiral Gregory gave the order to fire the Ragnarok missiles, and 6 of them launched from different ships in the fleet. Each missile carried enough explosive force to shatter a small moon, and they streaked toward the shipyard, leaving trails of fire behind them. The facility's shields activated, but they were designed to protect against normal weapons, not the concentrated fury of weapons that humanity had built specifically to destroy hardened targets. The missiles impacted in sequence, and each detonation magnified the last in a cascade of destruction. The shipyard came apart in slow motion as massive explosions tore through its structure. Docking bays broke free and spun off into space, trailing debris and atmosphere. Construction cranes collapsed and fell through the vacuum in twisted tangles of metal. Ships that had been nearly complete were shattered before they could ever fly. Within 5 minutes, the largest military shipyard in the Vakari Dominion was reduced to expanding clouds of wreckage that would drift in orbit for centuries. Amy confirmed the destruction with a shaking voice and estimated that the attack had set back Vakari shipbuilding capacity by at least a decade. Daniel nodded slowly and felt no satisfaction in the destruction, but only a grim sense of necessity. He ordered his helmsman to set course for the next target because they were not done until every Vakari military installation was reduced to rubble. The campaign would continue for 3 more weeks, and each battle would be shorter than the last as Vakari resistance crumbled under the sustained assault. Humanity had unleashed something that had been sleeping for 2 centuries, and the Vakari Dominion was learning a harsh lesson about the difference between peaceful species and weak species. The humans had been peaceful by choice, not because they lacked the ability to wage war. Now that choice had been revoked, and the galaxy was seeing what happened when apex predators stopped pretending to be herbivores. The Vakari had wanted to test humanity's resolve, and now they were paying the price for that test with their military power, and their pride, and their future. The space above the Vakari homeworld was crowded with the wreckage of what had once been a proud fleet that dominated this region of the galaxy. Daniel Harper stood on the bridge of the USS Defender, looking down at the planet where billions of Vakari citizens waited to learn their fate. 8 weeks had passed since the war began, and in that time the human fleet had systematically dismantled every military installation and destroyed every warship that dared to challenge them. The Vakari Dominion's power was shattered, and their colonies were under blockade, and now they faced the question of what kind of victors humanity would be. The human fleet held position with weapons trained on the few remaining military installations on the planet's surface. Every captain knew they could glass the entire world if ordered to do so, but that was not why they had come here. This war had been about justice, not genocide, and humanity needed to prove they were better than the species who had attacked New Horizon. Lieutenant Amy Stevens announced they were receiving a transmission from the Vakari government, requesting terms of surrender, and Daniel told her to put it through, because this was the moment that would define everything. A Vakari official appeared on screen, and her scales were dull with exhaustion and defeat. She identified herself as Minister Kalara of the Vakari Council and said they wished to discuss terms. Daniel looked at her without sympathy and said the terms were simple. The Vakari would surrender every individual involved in planning or executing the attack on New Horizon, and those people would face trial for war crimes. They would pay reparations to the families of every victim. They would reduce their military to defensive forces only and submit to human inspection teams for the next 50 years. Minister Kalara's eyes closed briefly, and she said that accepting those terms would leave the Vakari vulnerable to their enemies, who had been waiting for an opportunity to attack. Daniel responded with cold logic and said the Vakari should have considered that before committing genocide. He said they had wanted to test humanity's resolve, and now they were living with the consequences of that test. There would be no negotiation and no compromise, because the time for that had passed when the Vakari chose to ignore 72 hours of warnings. Kalara asked what guarantee they had that humanity would not simply exterminate them once they were defenseless. She said they had seen what human ships were capable of, and knew they could wipe the Vakari civilization from existence if they wanted to. It was a fair question, and Daniel had been expecting it because he would have asked the same thing if their positions were reversed. He told her she was right to be afraid because humanity could destroy their world, and many humans would cheer if the Vakari homeworld was turned to glass. He paused and let that sink in before continuing. He said humanity had the weapons and the will, and after what happened to New Horizon, many people wanted revenge. But humans would not do it because, unlike the Vakari, they did not believe in genocide. Humanity believed in justice, which meant the Vakari would face consequences for their actions, but those consequences would not include the murder of innocent civilians. Daniel said that humanity was better than that, even if the Vakari were not. Minister Kalara was silent for a long moment before asking why humanity would show mercy after everything that had happened. Daniel thought about the photograph in his pocket of children playing in New Horizon parks and families building homes and people dreaming of a peaceful future. He said that 40,000 people had died believing in a better universe where different species could coexist peacefully. Humanity owed it to their memory to prove that universe was still possible, even if they had to enforce that peace with warships and weapons. The transmission ended, and Admiral Gregory Stone appeared on a private channel, asking how Daniel was holding up. Daniel admitted he was tired and ready to go home, and Gregory said that would happen soon because the Vakari would accept the terms, since they had no other choice. But Gregory said they needed to discuss what came next, because the war had changed everything about humanity's place in the galaxy. The Galactic Council was in chaos, and half the member species were terrified of humans while the other half were asking for protection from their own aggressive neighbors. Daniel laughed bitterly and said humanity had spent 2 centuries trying to prove they were peaceful, and it took only 8 weeks of warfare to earn respect. Gregory agreed and said it was more than respect because what the galaxy felt now was fear. Every species with enemies was suddenly interested in human military assistance, and every species with conquest on their minds was suddenly much more cautious. The galaxy had been watching the war, and they had seen what happened when humanity stopped playing nice. Gregory explained that Earth needed to create a new doctrine for dealing with alien civilizations. Humanity would become the peacekeeper of the galaxy whether other species liked it or not. They would stop genocides before they happened and protect weak species from strong ones. Anyone who committed atrocities like New Horizon would face human justice regardless of what the Galactic Council said. It was a dangerous path because it meant humanity was taking on the role of galactic police without being asked. Daniel worried they might become tyrants themselves if they were not careful about how they used their power. Gregory agreed and said that was why they needed good people like Daniel, who remembered why they fought. People who understood the difference between justice and revenge, and who would not abuse the power humanity now possessed. The responsibility was enormous, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic, but there was no other choice because someone needed to maintain order. 3 days later, the Vakari Council agreed to every term without modification. The war criminals were surrendered to human custody, and trials began immediately. Reparations were signed, and inspection teams began dismantling military installations across Vakari space. The Vakari Dominion joined the growing list of civilizations under human protection, which was a polite way of saying they were now client states that existed at humanity's pleasure. It was not the outcome anyone had wanted, but it was the outcome the Vakari had earned through their actions. In the months that followed, the galaxy began to understand the new reality of human power. Species that had been aggressive started reconsidering their expansion plans because nobody wanted to face what the Vakari had faced. Weak species that had been bullied for generations suddenly found themselves under human protection and discovered that having humanity as a friend meant their enemies left them alone. The Galactic Council tried to reassert its authority, but everyone knew the real power now belonged to Earth. The Council eventually appointed humanity as the primary peacekeeping force, which was just them acknowledging what everyone already knew. It was recognition of power, not friendship, because the other species did not trust humans, but they respected the threat humanity represented. Some species tried to build coalitions against human dominance, but those efforts fell apart because nobody wanted to be the next. Example of what happened when you challenged Earth. Daniel stood in a memorial garden on Earth that had been built to honor those lost at New Horizon. 40,000 names were carved into black stone walls, and flowers had been planted around them by families and friends who wanted beauty to grow from tragedy. President Helen Morrison found him there looking at the names and told him the USS Defender was being sent back into deep space. There were reports of another aggressive species attacking colony worlds in the outer reach, and Daniel's mission was to stop them. Daniel asked if this was what humanity had become, which was the galaxy's police force that went around stopping conflicts. Helen said it was what humanity had to become, because if they did not, then who would? The galaxy needed protectors, and humans had learned the hard way that peaceful species needed someone willing to fight for them. The lesson had cost 40,000 lives, and now humanity would make sure no other species had to learn it the same way. Daniel touched one of the carved names belonging to a child who had died on New Horizon and asked if humanity was still civilized after everything they had done. Helen said that humans were civilized when they chose to be, but warriors when they needed to be. That combination was what made humanity dangerous and what would keep the peace. They could be gentle with friends and ruthless with enemies, and that flexibility was their greatest strength. Captain Daniel Harper returned to his ship, and the USS Defender lifted from Earth's surface to join the fleet heading for the outer reach. As they climbed toward orbit, he looked back at his homeworld and thought about how much had changed in just a few months. Humanity had revealed its true nature to the galaxy and shown that they were apex predators who had been hiding behind civilization. That revelation had made some species afraid and others relieved, but all of them now understood one simple truth. Humanity would not fire the first shot and would always prefer peace over war. But if you attacked the innocent or committed genocide or threatened the stability of the galaxy, then you would face the full wrath of a species that had climbed from caves to stars through intelligence and ruthlessness. You would face humanity unleashed and you would learn why they had stopped being civilized. The USS Defender accelerated toward the edge of the solar system, carrying that